Looks like it's. Okay, hopefully everyone can hear me. Perfect. All right, well, thank you everyone for joining us today for our accessory dwelling unit small and mighty webinar. Today's webinar is brought to you by the Cuyahoga County Planning Commission here in downtown Cleveland. We're also being joined by our friends with the First Suburbs Consortium, APA Ohio Cleveland, and the City of Cleveland Heights. So just a little bit of housekeeping before we really kind of hop into things. Again, this webinar is being recorded, so for folks that maybe couldn't attend today, we'll have it available for folks to watch later on. We are going to reserve some time at the end for questions and answers. So you should see at the bar there at the bottom, next to the raise hand function, you should just be able to click Q&A. So any questions you have, go ahead and throw them in the box, and we're going to go ahead and go to those at the end of the presentation. So for the webinar today, what we're going to be talking about mostly are what are accessory dwelling units, kind of why are we here? Why is the trend, the housing trends that we're seeing right now pushing towards accessory dwelling units? And what does that look like here in Cuyahoga County specifically? We'll look a little bit about ADUs and zoning and kind of why ADUs can and can't be built in certain manners and why things kind of start and end with zoning. We'll talk specifically about the City of Cleveland Heights and kind of our work as county planning, working with our partners with at the City of Cleveland Heights and the process they underwent to really evaluate their zoning to allow accessory dwelling units. Then we'll talk about next steps that the City of Cleveland Heights is actually currently undertaking, and our work continues with them. But what do those next steps look like for accessory dwelling units in the City of Cleveland Heights? So what are ADUs? So throughout our research kind of this past year, as we've been looking at accessory dwelling units, there were a number of different definitions, but this is really the definitions that we focused on. So accessory dwelling units, ADUs, are secondary or auxiliary structures or spaces that provide that additional dwelling unit on a lot where an existing home is already constructed. So really creating a separate space besides just the principal dwelling on the lot, where someone else, an additional family, a family unit, could live on the same lot. So just some facts, I guess, a little bit about accessory dwelling units, kind of the benefits, if you will, of accessory dwelling units. So did you know that ADUs can provide more housing options at more affordable price points? So obviously it's a smaller unit, it's going to cost less than that principal dwelling, but you're going to be increasing that residential density. So if you look at a community, let's say that has, 15,000 lots, one home per lot, you could essentially double that if you think about it in terms of providing an additional unit that wasn't already there to begin with. Accessory dwelling units can be a tool for additional income and wealth building. This is specifically relating to, units that are being rented out, not necessarily for housing family, but if you have it on the market, whether that's, a market rate type apartment setup, but it could really be that tool and make it an attainable wealth building tool for people that maybe didn't have that before. ADUs can offset utility development and service costs. So this is a really great example you can see here in the picture on the left of an accessory dwelling unit or a basement that's been converted into an accessory dwelling unit. So utilizing the existing spaces within the principal dwelling unit, so an attached accessory dwelling unit is a great way to offset some of those utility costs. So you're sharing kind of the costs of the utility, whether it's power, water, you name it. It's a great opportunity to share those costs and kind of split them amongst the principal dwelling, so one unit, and the accessory dwelling unit, another unit. And I think one of the most important things, especially in the City of Cleveland Heights as well, is providing a space for a multi-generational household. So especially in some of our historic neighborhoods, like the City of Cleveland Heights, a lot of these homes are 2, even 3 stories. Perhaps, older parents, as they're getting older, they're aging, they're kind of being almost forced out of their homes because, the traditional homes, they can't go up and down the stairs. Maybe they need an assistance device, or maybe folks that are in a wheelchair. They can't necessarily navigate those spaces, but an accessory dwelling unit on the same property allows you to care for either an aging parent, maybe a relative, friends, whomever, or even provide space for an on-site caregiver for those people on the existing lot. So you're still close and nearby family, but they still have their own space to be independent that of the principal dwelling. And this should, really come as no surprise, as it being a smaller unit, they typically require far less materials to construct than a single family home. So when you think about it, again, it really depends on what part of the country you're in, but generally require far less materials and obviously the cost to build than a single family home. So that's just a little bit of highlights of accessory dwelling units and kind of the benefits to really kind of get our minds thinking about what exactly all of this means. But in terms of ADU and zoning, as I mentioned it before, ADUs, allowing them within your community really starts and ends with good zoning. Having the right zoning in place will really help support them. Anything that might be misaligned, zoning is really kind of that biggest obstacle to constructing or allowing different types of uses within any type of community, but certainly accessory dwelling units. So what really needs to happen first is communities need to evaluate their zoning codes to make sure they have the rules and regulations in place to support the type of development they want. And in this case, accessory dwelling units. So there was one question that kind of popped up in the chat that I'd like to address. The question was, what's the difference between an accessory dwelling unit or a attached accessory dwelling unit and a double? So really the double, you're thinking about a home that's intentionally the principal dwelling itself, the principal structure itself is that double. So an accessory dwelling unit is generally smaller in size. It can be attached. There are some instances in the city of Cleveland Heights where doubles are essentially becoming a legal three. So you have your double, which is unit, but then you have a legal three kind of in the attic converted space. But the thing that really makes an accessory dwelling unit an accessory dwelling unit is it was, brought onto that lot secondarily to that principal structure. And another thing that's important to note is that accessory dwelling unit is usually always defined by a separate entry point. So if you're double, like you go into the principal structure, there's a shared entry point, not necessarily an accessory dwelling unit, but if that attic space, for example, has a separate entrance point that maybe there's a staircase outside of that double that leads to the attic for that accessory dwelling unit, that would be more or less what we would define as kind of the difference between the double there and the accessory dwelling unit. Hopefully that answered your question, but we're going to keep rolling ahead. So with our accessory dwelling unit study that we partnered with the city of Cleveland Heights, one of the things that we really wanted to evaluate were zoning codes kind of across the country, where communities have successfully implemented accessory dwelling unit language. And in many cases, a lot of these communities, not just the ones we see here, they started off really, really strict in many cases with their guidelines and what they would permit for accessory dwelling units. And over time, they've rolled them back. What these communities have come to find is that those, more strict policies, they weren't seeing kind of the applications coming forward because they were too strict with building accessory dwelling units. And that could be for a number of reasons. Some of the regulations had very, very strict design guidelines. Some of the regulations had very, very strict height or parking or something that was really limiting people coming forward with successful applications. So some of these communities, again, rolled them back. In addition to our efforts, just in terms of research, we also talked to these communities physically. So on here, we specifically looked at St. Louis Park, Minnesota, Minneapolis, the city of Bloomington, Indiana, actually Anchorage, Alaska. They have really interesting ADU regulations, and they're really kind of a leader in what they're allowing within their community for accessory dwelling units. And then also the city of Cincinnati. So we talked specifically to Bloomington, Anchorage, and Cincinnati. We also talked to some folks from the National Association of Realtors. And then we talked to a resident who, I guess, 30 plus years in the city of Cleveland Heights has actually been trying to construct an accessory dwelling unit, essentially a granny flat, just another name for an accessory dwelling unit. And then we also talked to an architect also from the city of Cleveland Heights showing interest in accessory dwelling units. But all of this together, we came across and found a number of different similarities and differences in terms of ADU regulations across the country. So in terms of some similarities, one thing that we found in common was property owner requirements. So whether that be the principal dwelling or the accessory dwelling unit, a property owner must live on site. That was something pretty common that we saw amongst all of those regulations. I think one really good example is the city of Cincinnati. So it's not necessarily the property owner that has to live on site. They can delegate, quote unquote, a responsible person that is then being living on that site again, whether that be the principal dwelling or the accessory dwelling unit, to make sure that someone is there associated with the property living on site. Permitted uses. Largely, accessory dwelling units are permitted usually within single-family zoning districts. And one other important thing to note here, again, this is where that strict to not so strict, where some of those regulations began rolling back. Many of these zoning codes don't require an additional off-street parking space. So if you're in a single-family neighborhood, they might require 2 covered, so within a garage. Accessory dwelling is typically, we're not seeing that additional off-street parking space be required. Now, that is to say, this is typically supplemented with existing on-street parking. So there's a little bit of a taboo there. So if you're in a community where maybe overnight on-street parking might be a little limited, that's something that cities need to think about as well. Where are these people going to store and park their cars every day? So number of structures, we typically have found that only 1 accessory dwelling unit is permitted per lot. In many cases, this will count towards the total permitted number of accessory structures on a lot. And in the case of Cleveland Heights, if it's 2, if there's already an existing garage, if you have a detached accessory dwelling unit, that's your total allotment for accessory structures permitted on that particular lot, as an example. So typologies. There's 2 main types. You got your attached and detached. And as I said before, attached, so we're thinking anything like in addition to a house, or you're converting an existing space like an attic or a basement. Those are typically your attached accessory dwelling units. Detached units, this is what we more commonly come across. These are the ones that, are specifically kind of self-contained units detached from the principal dwelling, typically located in side and rear yards. One thing we did come across, those structure conversions, there were limited guidelines on what the actual kind of rules and regulations were on those structure conversions. So that's really kind of a community by community basis. It's more common to see those detached units, as I kind of mentioned earlier, than structure conversions, a truly separate unit for an accessory dwelling unit. ADU site locations, I think I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but really ADUs are most commonly permitted only within side and rear yards. Rarely did we see anything permitted within front yards. I think Cleveland Heights is a unique example where there are some existing structures, again, very historic properties that have carriage houses. So essentially a carriage house is an accessory dwelling unit, but they do often, more times than not, exist in the front yards. And we'll talk about this a little bit later, but the current work that we're working on with the city is actually updating their zoning regulations to allow accessory dwelling units. And one of those things is taking those carriage houses, which are essentially legal non-conforming structures or uses on these property right now, and basically allowing them to be transformed into accessory dwelling units. And lastly, in terms of similarities, I think I mentioned this during the doubles discussion. ADUs typically always require a separate exterior entrance, separate of the principal dwellings. In some instances, we did see, again, this comes from some of those more strict communities with their accessory dwelling units in terms of design, where front doors cannot face the street. So either they didn't have side entrance, or the ADU needs to be situated on the lot in the rear part of the lot where that front door cannot be seen or visible from the main street or whatever street they're located on. So some of the more common differences that we came across within all of these zoning codes as well were the actual size of accessory dwelling units. So again, some of the communities we looked at, Anchorage, Alaska, as an example, some of these lots are very, very large. So the overall size of the ADU can vary greatly. Some of them, as small as 250 square feet, basically minimum living space, all the way up to, 2,000 square feet. But really what we saw was kind of this happy medium at about 800 square feet was really kind of what we came across in terms of overall maximum size in communities. So setbacks, again, ranging greatly, really depends on how big the lot kind of is. But generally, we found 5 feet, between 5 and 40 feet. But it was most common to see those setbacks follow those assigned by the principal dwelling. So, for an example, if a house on an existing lot has a 5 foot, side yard setback, it would be expected that the accessory dwelling would also have a 5 foot side yard setback, as an example. Now, some of these examples for an accessory dwelling unit, like the one picture we saw where the basement was converted into an accessory dwelling unit, may require some minor encroachments into some of those setbacks to accommodate the accessory dwelling unit for that separate entrance point into the ADU. So digging down into the basement to provide that access point, if the house is already on that 5 foot yard setback, 5 foot line setback, and you're converting the basement, an encroachment into that side yard may be necessary. ADU heights, again, similar to some of the other regulations that we've talked about, but generally, accessory dwelling units should not be taller than the principal dwelling. We did see maximum height somewhere between 15 and 25 feet. Some communities, again, with a little more strict guidelines, tended to also even regulate interior ceiling heights to making sure these spaces are bright and vibrant, good airflow, sunlight, you name it, making sure these spaces actually feel comfortable, especially if a unit is 250 square feet. We want to make sure, people aren't just living in a shed, that they actually have livable, comfortable space to call home. So in terms of the design, design and materials for ADUs also really varies. Some communities choose to be a little more strict on the look and the feel of these accessory dwelling units. But it's really, really common for accessory dwelling units to be required to have a permanent foundation, and specifically no mobile or movable tiny homes. So any of those tiny homes you see on wheels are typically, that's not permitted. Basically, so you can't move a tiny home and call it an accessory dwelling unit into someone's backyard. That was typically mentioned as, not being permitted. But another example for design is, I believe it's the city of Cincinnati, basically choosing not to regulate design at all. So again, trying to remove barriers to allow people to be creative, but also not dictating exactly what the design looks like, and kind of letting them choose what it looks like to, again, expedite the process, really trying to get more units, more livable spaces for people on the ground that weren't there before. Utility connections, mentioned this briefly. Most accessory dwelling units are required to have those utility hookups, but this can take on many different forms. So this could be shared meters with that principal dwelling, but it really is going to be dependent upon what's in your immediate area and what local utilities are available to you to your specific lot. So now we're going to hop in and to get a little bit more Cleveland Heights specific. So as I mentioned before, the Cleveland Heights zoning study, we really kind of kicked that off last year, and we went through a really big process in evaluating different zoning codes throughout the country, but also taking a really, really deep, close look at Cleveland Heights zoning code specifically. So in terms of Cleveland Heights, what we kind of came across with our study, there's changing demographics. There's been historic population loss. There's shifts in housing demands. But really our overall goal with that study was really trying to find a balance between affordability and revitalization within its housing market. So ADUs are a great kind of incremental way to achieve that housing affordability and create that lasting population growth. So what we did with their specific zoning code review, we looked at their accessory use regulations within the AA single family districts and the B2 family. So if you recall kind of earlier in the presentation, a lot of accessory dwelling units in some of the zoning codes across the country that we've looked at really were only permitted within single family uses. I think Cleveland Heights is a really great example of where accessory dwelling units could also be permitted within a 2-family district. So these are the types of regulations that we looked at within their zoning code. So we looked at minimum yard requirements. We looked at where permitted structures should be located. We looked at yard coverage. We looked at other supplemental regulations, including parking, accessory buildings, accessory structures, because technically those are different things within Cleveland Heights zoning code, but then also the residential use of existing carriage houses. So these are all different things that we've looked at within their specific zoning. So City of Cleveland Heights, similar to just about every other community in Cuyahoga County, does not allow accessory dwelling units. So under the city's current regulations, very few lots would actually meet the requirements to accommodate an accessory dwelling unit. So there are a lot of limiting factors at play that would really kind of halt someone who would want to put in an accessory dwelling unit, especially a detached unit on their property. Those being the height of the structure, setbacks, obviously permitted uses because accessory dwelling units are not allowed right now, yard coverage, lot sizes, and widths. Those are all big key limiting factors prohibiting someone from constructing an accessory dwelling unit on their property. So not only did we review the zoning legislation for the city of Cleveland Heights, we also wanted to take some lots and actually test the theory of, can someone actually build an accessory dwelling unit? What would it look like? So this is an example of one of the AA single family lots. So in the city of Cleveland Heights, the AA single family lots are generally the largest lots that you're going to find in the community. So within the AA single family district, the minimum lot size is 15,000 feet and a minimum of 100 feet of street frontage. Accessory buildings within this district can occupy up to 20% of rear yards. Just an example, kind of laying a baseline here. This particular lot, as you can see, is very, very large and certainly meets the minimum standards for an AA single family property in Cleveland Heights. So this particular lot, again, this is just an example, but we did reference a specific kind of subset of the community here to kind of show you what could happen. So this particular lot, 47,236 square feet in size. You can see there in the front, kind of where that sidewalk and driveway are, 176 feet of frontage. And then what you're seeing in kind of that smaller structure is a garage and carriage house. So all of that together is about 1,500 square feet. And again, that's a legal non-conforming structure, that carriage house. And then the rear yard that you see in the back there is about 15,000 square feet or so of rear yard for this particular lot. Now, pretty much anything on the AA single family lots, these are generally much larger houses, and they have the space to really accommodate most types of accessory dwelling units. So as I said before, they're allowed to have 20% rear yard coverage of those accessory buildings. So if we're saying it's about 15,000 square feet for that rear yard, 20% of that, accessory structures can cover up to 3,000 square feet of that rear yard, leaving about 1,500 square feet or so for an accessory dwelling unit after accommodating the 1,500 square feet for the existing garage and carriage house. So you're talking about a 1,500 square foot accessory dwelling unit on this particular property. And what's interesting about these AA single family lots, because they are so large, in this particular example, we're also showing a corner lot. So the main street being in the front there and the side being where that new driveway could potentially go. The city does permit lots greater than 100 feet in width there of frontage to have a secondary driveway. So this is an example of what could happen based on existing zoning in Cleveland Heights for an AA single family lot of this size and scale, could accommodate essentially a small home on its lot. So a 1,500 square foot accessory dwelling unit with a separate driveway. But other units that could happen in here, they certainly accommodate an interior conversion. The carriage house is always an option. There's even a garage conversion that could happen. And then any other, attached units could do in addition to the house. So really, within the AA single family district, there's a lot of opportunity here for accessory dwelling units. Now, bringing us back down to, the more realistic opportunities within the community, what happens on kind of more of a standard single family lot here in the city of Cleveland Heights. So this is an example of an A single family home within the city of Cleveland Heights. So within the A single family district, lots have to be at least 7,500 square feet in size and have 50 feet of frontage. So you can see here, this is a conforming lot. This particular lot is about 7,800 square feet in size. It has 50 feet of frontage, and it does have an existing 600 square foot garage that you can see there in the rear. And the entire rear yard is about 3,000 square feet, we'll say, for this example. So within this example, homes within the A single family district, they're actually allowed to have two garages. They're allowed to have an attached and a detached. Within the A single family district, garages cannot be larger than 600 square feet. And it's important to note that for every square foot that the lot is larger than 6,000 square feet, you can have an additional 15 square feet to that garage. So what does that actually look like in terms of an accessory dwelling unit? So The above, so the lot is 7,800 square feet. For every, again, thinking about 1,000 square feet, it's larger. Sorry, for every 15 feet is larger than that, you can accommodate that to 1,800 square feet that we have left over from that 6,000 square foot minimum. An additional square footage that you could add to the garage is 120 square feet. So you're looking at an accessory dwelling unit if you were to add that additional 120 square feet to the 600 square foot garage, an accessory dwelling unit of 720 square feet. So you have your 600 square foot garage plus your 120 square foot addition. That would essentially eliminate the garage, but you would get a 720 square foot accessory dwelling unit. Other options that could be available to properties like this are interior conversions. So attic, basement, but really what we're going to be seeing mostly in these circumstances are the garage conversions, expansions, potentially another detached unit if we're not going to convert the garage. But one of the biggest limiting factors here for this particular accessory dwelling unit is the ability to go up. So the garage is capped at 15 feet in height. So our ability to build on top of that is limited right now by the existing zoning code. So our last test that we looked at was the B2 family district. So this is the duplex. So a number of these duplexes right now in the city of Cleveland Heights are, the lots are a bit smaller, they're a bit tighter. So actually within the B2 family district, a conforming lot has to be 10,000 square feet in size, and they have to be 60 feet of frontage. So this particular example is on a corner. But it's also non-conforming in size. So this is just under the minimum square footage in size, so 9,570 square feet, and has 52 feet of frontage. The garage, according to the auditor site, we're looking at about 770 square feet. It is detached from the principal dwelling there, the two-family unit. And the backyard is about 2,700 square feet. So what would an ADU look like right now based on current regulations? So due to this lot actually being undersized, if this lot was conforming, they could have 30% rear yard coverage, but because it is non-conforming, it's actually raised to 40%. So that the private parking garage that you're seeing up on there before, the private parking garage is on a corner lot like this one is actually raised even higher to 60% of the rear yard. So if we take into account 60% of the 2,700 square feet of the rear yard is about 1,620 square feet for an overall accessory dwelling unit, but it is actually capped at 1,300 square feet. So if we take our 1,300 square feet total minus our about 770 square foot garage, we're still left with a 530 square foot accessory dwelling unit. And that's keeping the existing garage for this example on the double. So you can keep your two-family unit, potentially even a legal 3. Maybe there's a unit also in the attic, and you have an accessory dwelling unit in the rear yard. Again, all of these examples are kind of maximizing what would be permitted in Cleveland Heights today. But it's our job to really look at and ask ourselves, is this the direction the community wants to go? So really in terms of next steps, us looking at the zoning code is taking this to the public and really trying to understand, based on existing, zoning regulations, is this the direction you want to see the community going? Are these ADUs too big? Are they too small? So that's really what we're going to be looking at in terms of kind of next steps in our zoning work with the city of Cleveland Heights. So what does all of this mean? Based on the city's current zoning requirements, number one, and obviously the biggest limiting factor in Cleveland Heights, ADUs aren't allowed. That's going to be probably the biggest limiting factor compared to anything else. ADUs can be accommodated on existing lots within the city. However, limiting factors in the city zoning code will make their construction very challenging. So like I said before, going up is going to be a challenge. Those heights are capped at 15 feet. Setbacks are also going to be a challenge because, we're really working within a relatively small envelope there. Permitted uses, again, they're not permitted. Yard coverage is really, really interesting, and I'll dive in a little bit deeply here. So right now, how the city of Cleveland Heights has the zoning code set up within these districts that we looked at for accessory dwelling units, they manage yard coverage yard by yard. So front yard has, a maximum coverage. The side yard has, their own coverage, and rear yard has its own coverage. And one of the things that we've been talking about with the city and our staff here at County Planning is, what if we looked at the lot as a whole and we looked at whole lot coverage? So we're evaluating different percentages and thinking about what that could look like if we say 75% was our cap, regardless on what yard they're in, whether it's the front yard, the side yard, the rear yard, total lot coverage being 75 feet. And that would also take into account some of the the number of lots that are vastly undersized could then accept and would be, approved for an accessory dwelling unit, looking at it in terms of overall coverage instead of other types of minimums that would really limit people from doing this type of construction on their own lot. So all of our research from all of this, looking at Cleveland Heights zoning code, comparing it to all the other zoning codes across the country. I know it's a little small to see, but I just wanted to give everyone an example of the types of recommendations that came out of our study. So this took all of the different pieces of the zoning code that we looked at in the city of Cleveland Heights and provided our own kind of recommendations. What would a potential change look like, and some of the things to consider as you implement those changes in terms of recommended zoning changes. So all of those sections, we went ahead and basically used it like a framework, because as a result of the study, we have then continued our work with the city of Cleveland Heights to actually physically update the zoning language to begin to think about allowing accessory dwelling units within the city of Cleveland Heights. And I wanted to spend a little bit of time on this map. I think this map is really, really interesting. And I just think it shows really what we're working with in terms of what's available within the city of Cleveland Heights. So this is a map that we created with some of our other colleagues here at County Planning. And basically what this looked like and what we're seeing here is we're showing the zoning and all of the parcels within the A, the AA, and the B districts within the city of Cleveland Heights. And basically what we did, you can see in kind of the blown up legend there on the left, is we're showing the available area after we applied the 75% lot coverage tool, if you will. So basically we looked at impervious surfaces. So this includes driveways. This includes any sort of building, physical structure on the lots. How much space is left over for an accessory dwelling unit? So you can see in the legend, basically any property that's red or even orange, basically there's not enough space left over to accommodate at least a 400 square foot. 400 is kind of the minimum that we chose for this particular study. It could not support an accessory dwelling unit of at least 400 square feet. Now, as you start getting into the middle of the legend there, kind of the lightest green, the 401 to 800 square feet, this is where we're going to start seeing, yes, these lots can support an accessory dwelling unit of at least 400 square feet. Then you can see kind of in the lightest green there, or the middle green, the 800 to 1600 square feet, there's a lot more properties there. But I think what's really, really interesting is just the darkest green that you can see there. How many lots actually have more than 1,600 square feet to essentially play with to accommodate an accessory dwelling unit? I do have some numbers here that I just think is just really interesting. So within the A district, just the A single family district, 99% of the lots can support an accessory dwelling unit of at least 400 square feet. So we're talking about over 13,000 lots that you're seeing here on this map. Within the AA district, again, those are typically the larger lots within the city of Cleveland Heights. 100%, that doesn't surprise us. 100% of the lots can support at least a 400 square foot accessory dwelling unit. So that's 554 lots. And then last but not least, we have our B2 family district. Within the B2 family district, 82% of lots can support an accessory dwelling unit of at least 400 square feet. So that's about 949 lots. So I think this just goes to show that there's a lot of opportunity within Cleveland Heights to support accessory dwelling units, to get new housing on the ground in the city of Cleveland Heights that's both affordable and attainable, and really creating a mechanism for people to have an opportunity to create their own wealth, having that wealth building tool on their property. And I think this is just a really exciting map of opportunity within Cleveland Heights. Okay, I've certainly talked quite a bit. In terms of next steps within the city of Cleveland Heights, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to them, both Karen Knittel And Eric Zamp, if you want to introduce yourselves as we kind of talk a little about what the city of Cleveland Heights is doing now that we've kind of concluded the study and what the future looks like for accessory dwelling units in Cleveland Heights.
Well, thank you, Rachel, and thanks to the county team for really doing a great job. Just for those of you who don't know me, I'm Eric Zamp, Director of Planning and Development for Cleveland Heights, and I'm here with Karen Knittel, who's the Assistant Director. I did want to give a shout out to some of our current staff and former staff who really helped out on this project. And when we started this journey with the county, we knew that this was going to be a controversial topic. And a topic that really needed more than just zoning, more than just good case examples, but a project that needed some real life examples in Cleveland Heights. And fortunately for us, the best source for accessory dwelling units is the AARP. And fortunately for us, they have a thing called a design competition, a community challenge grant. And besides getting a cool t-shirt like this, what they also do is they provide money to do things like have design competitions, which has been a trend that they've been doing over the past couple of years. So if you go to the next slide, we applied for a challenge grant with the ARP along with the Great Ohio Policy Center, who's doing some work on a statewide pattern book, similar to what they did in Michigan. And we were awarded, or it became a community competition community, whereby we're having a design competition, and we created two categories. One is a juried category for those firms and architects, professionals, to come up with ADUs that people could then really try to sink their teeth into and get an idea what this is. And then a people's choice. We wanted to open it up so that folks that don't have a design background, even children, could enter into the competition. And the idea is that we're going to award the juried ones, the design professionals, a stipend of $3,200, $3,250 to take their winning designs and bring that towards an actual pre-approved plan design. And then for the People's Choice, there's a one-time winner awardee of $1,500. And we're also bringing on an architect to help bring that design to a full design. The goal, of course, being those pre-approved plans. A lot of the work that the county has done over the past couple of years with the TOD study and the single family zoning study has really pointed towards making our processes a lot easier, because while construction is expensive, so is the process of getting through the approval process. And so with that idea of having pre-approved plans in place with actual architects and designs, we also wanted to make sure that people were being creative, people were looking at resilient and sustainable design, but also affordable design. And then also use this design competition as a way to engage the community and educate them, because again, we know that this is a controversial topic. So I'll throw it to Karen to walk through some of the details of what we're doing. And we're happy to answer questions about the design competition at the end.
Thank you. So we announced our design competition on this September 3rd. And as you can see through this timeline, we then on September 17th had a couple of question and answer sessions so that we could encourage design professionals to really be thinking creatively and to participate. The submission deadline was October 21st. And so for the People's Choice Award, that voting began on October 23rd and actually just ended this past Friday. So November 15th was the end of that voting. On December 4th, we will be announcing the winners of both the People's Choice Award as well as the 3 jury design winners. So we're very excited about that, but we're going to save the announcement until December 4th. You can go to the next slide. Thank you. So the competition requirements were really pretty basic, and we kept the requirements pretty simple because we wanted the design teams to be creative, and we wanted to see what they would come up with that would fit on a typical Cleveland Heights parcel. So they were told that an ADU needed to have a kitchen, a bathroom, a sleeping area, and a separate entrance. The only other requirements, as you can see, is that we said that the ADU could be anywhere from 250 square feet to 1,000 square feet. We did not require them to show any additional parking for the ADU. We said the maximum height could be 24 feet. And about the only reality check that we had in terms of our current zoning code was that we said it needed to be at least a minimum of 5 feet from side or rear property line. And in our A single family district, that's the requirement for principal houses, but also in all of our residential districts, if there's a garage that has people uses in it, it has to be 5 feet off the property line. So if you want to go to the next slide, thanks. So we did include some community engagement. This was put on, of course, on our website. We did press releases. It also out through our digital newsletter and social media. We were lucky enough that we had a couple newspaper articles and actually an editorial picked up about, what are ADUs and is it a good idea? So we feel like we were really fortunate in the timing of this and got some good information out there. So I should have said to you when we were on that last slide that we did get 28 submissions, which is great. 5 of them were for the People's Choice. So 5 were non-architects or designers, and the balance were architects and designers. So if we can go to the next slide. So as you heard, our goal is to get some pre-approved ADU plans. And by pre-approved, we mean that in Cleveland Heights, we have an architectural board of review that reviews the design of any structure in Cleveland Heights. So our intent is to move these pre-approved designs through that process so that you could hopefully take them and then work with a design professional to have it built on your individual lot. That you would still need to go through, of course, the regular building requirement of building permits. These are permanent structures, so you would need your foundation or your slab that you're building off of and your water and sewer line connections and all those other utilities. So you're going to still need to have some design professional working with you, but you wouldn't have that time period of needing to have a design approved through the architectural board of review. So we think this would help a lot of our families move forward with implementing this type of housing on their own parcels. Okay. So what our intent is that we're modeling this after a sister city in Tucson who did this competition about a year ago, and they actually have a model library plans on their website. And so our intent is to take our pre-approved plans that we do that do get pre-approved and put them on the website. And we're hoping that as we go forward, there'll be other plans that'll come forward and that the architects will also want to allow them to be shared online, because of course we would share who the designers team were. And as I said, the property owners would still need to work with somebody to get it cited properly on their individual lots. So the intent is that we would have this model library plan on site on our website, and it would look something similar to what we're seeing for the city of Tucson. Okay. Great. I guess I'm back to Rachel.
Perfect, thank you. So I know that was a pretty high level overview. We could probably talk about accessory dwelling units all day. But we're gonna go ahead and open it up to it looks like questions were flowing in pretty regularly. So we're gonna go ahead and start answering some of those. And I did just want to mention, for those of you with AICP, this is available for CM credit. The number is there at the top. And we are recording this, so please share it. And once the recording's available, we'll send out another email to all the registrants. So you will have that for your future reference. So I just wanted, again, just to say thank you to everyone already. Our friends, Jennifer Kuzma, First Suburbs, APA Ohio Cleveland, and our friends at Cleveland Heights. But we're going to go ahead and start answering some questions. Let's see. There's quite a few Q&As. Looks like Eric has been responding to a few in the chat. Were there any in particular that stood out to you, Eric?
Hey, Rachel, we cannot hear Eric.
Oh,
Sorry, guys. Can you hear me now? Yes. Okay, great. Okay, yeah. So we did have a question related to regular accessory buildings and how that looks as far as greater or lesser setbacks and what those look like aligned. I don't know, Rachel, in your research, is there any kind of favor over aligning those with accessory buildings or not, and what that looks like? Just to touch on that a little bit.
so in terms of, oh, in terms of the actual, are you muted? Okay. In terms of the actual setbacks, you're talking about like if it's better to align accessory dwelling units with other accessory buildings. Um, I think that's, I think it's going to be different depending on the community you're in. Certainly, if it's more of a rural community versus a more urban community like Cleveland Heights, we don't really have the space to play around with overall setbacks. And as Karen said, the setbacks vary, like a garage. The garage is a good example. If it's a garage for cars, and Karen and Eric, please hop in if I'm misspeaking here. It's 3 feet, correct, from the rear lot line versus if it's intended for people use, it's 5 feet. Is that correct?
You got that right.
Karen, you might be muted.
I am not muted on my end.
Okay. Okay. Perfect.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear. Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, sorry, you were correct. So for just a standard garage, the requirement is that it be 3 feet from the property line. If it's something that it has more intensive people use, it's supposed to be 5 feet. So we have some garages that have office use in it, for example, some people working at home, or a pool house is required to be 5 feet from the property line.
Perfect. Yeah, so I guess it really depends on the community you're in and obviously the use that's going into it. In this case, in Cleveland Heights, it obviously depends on the use as an example for the garage or a garage conversion. And obviously, if it's an accessory dwelling unit that is then going into a garage, it'll, be illegal, I guess, non-conforming in a sense of like the carriage houses are now, I suppose, with in regards to a rear setback. But we're certainly looking at the whole total lot coverage is what we're considering going forward. So the 75% coverage is really what we're going to be looking at. One question that I think we get asked a lot that I'd like to address is the idea of Airbnbs. I can see the question here. How do you keep ADUs from becoming Airbnbs? I don't think you can necessarily prevent it. I think people are always going to do what they can get away with, I suppose. One thing that I think, the city of Cincinnati is a really good example in their legislation for accessory dwelling units. They have different types of covenants tied to the property. So as a result of that, the property owner themselves have to abide by certain rules. And if those rules get broken, they're not only fined $15,000, they are also, lose their privileges of that accessory dwelling unit, being rented or whatever it might be. So it, again, depends on the community, how far they want to take regulating different things. But it's important to note that, the accessory dwelling unit, starting to keep track of them with a register, is going to be important, knowing where they are, how they're being operated. And as we think ahead to zoning legislation, what are the types of things like, similar to maybe what Cincinnati has done? What are the types of rules that we want to implement as a result of those updated zoning changes is going to be important. Let's see. Yeah, so will Cleveland Heights require rental registration? I think, that conversation is still being had. We're still drafting the zoning regulations themselves. And I think once we take it in front of the public, once we take it in front of Planning Commission, get more feedback, we'll have a better idea on how far we should be taking regulations and which direction they should go. Let's see, there's a question here about fire separation. So did you research fire separation issues for attached ADUs? Are 2 means of egress required? So certainly the separate entry points are required in terms of fire separation. So I think the example we showed of the duplex with a potential accessory dwelling unit being attached to an existing garage, a lot of that's going to be building code, not necessarily zoning. And fire separation will certainly be required as part of that. And certainly, Eric or Karen, you feel free to hop in. Going out there during construction and having things inspected is going to be important, making sure there is a true fire separation there. I know this was oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, sure, this would require a building permit, so absolutely they would have to follow all the building codes, and being adjacent to a garage would require a firewall at the minimum, but there would be definitely building code issues that any ADU would need to address, and so it would be managed like any other construction project in Cleveland Heights in terms of inspections.
Yeah, definitely. Okay. I know there were a couple questions about development of accessory dwelling units. And there was one thing that I wanted to mention that I thought was really interesting that I didn't earlier. When we talked to Anchorage, Alaska, because there's a lot more available space around the city of Anchorage. In some instances, when people purchase a property, they're actually constructing an accessory dwelling unit, is what we would call it, first. They're building a small unit to build on their property. Then they're building their principal unit, which I thought was really interesting and a unique way to look at it. So they're living in the ADU while they're building their single family home, which was interesting. And then they'll rent out the accessory dwelling unit. So I thought that was a really interesting thing that I just wanted to share. Let's see. So here's a question. I guess I'll punt it to the city of Cleveland Heights because I know your recent experience with garages. Does Cleveland Heights Code currently require all properties to have a garage? So Karen, Eric, if you wanted to talk about garages in Cleveland Heights.
Sure, we can talk about that. So yes, currently there still is a requirement for there to be, excuse me, a 2-car garage for each single family home. So there is a process though, either through our zoning variances, there was always a process if you needed to do something different. But there's also a process through our planning commission currently to get permission to have a reduced number of enclosed parking spaces. And we think that as this moves forward, this may be another area that gets looked at as to would it make sense to allow an ADU as opposed to the garage space on a property, provided, of course, there was still off-street parking, because currently we still do require that. I don't know if you wanted to add anything, Eric.
Oh, you said it well, Karen.
Okay, so here's a good question talking about, attached garages are usually considered part of the main structure. What happens if the setback is greater for the main structure versus an accessory structure? So one thing we came across and conversations with the city of Cleveland Heights, and I think we kind of all agreed that essentially anything attached to the principal dwelling is part of the principal dwelling. Yes, the garage might be considered an accessory use, but it's still considered a piece of the principal structure. So it would then thereby abide by the principal structure setbacks, is I guess the simplest way I could probably put it. So if a house, the principal dwelling wanted to do an attached ADU, it would follow the setbacks set forth by the principal dwelling. But need to be careful though, thinking about the encroachments potentially into setbacks. Think about how it's actually getting attached to that principal dwelling, where the entrance is going to be. It does need to have that separate entrance point. But these are all just good things to consider if you're considering an accessory dwelling, especially an attached one. Let's see. A few more questions here. So there's also been a number of questions about taxes. So I think it obviously is going to vary greatly on the community and honestly, even what part of the country you're in, about what that tax will look like. Not necessarily about the tax bill, but would property taxes go up? I think is a common question that gets asked quite a bit. And we did have a conversation with our folks here in the county in terms of fiscal And they talked about their process and how they go about assessing different properties. And really what it comes down to is, they'll essentially, quote unquote, do their drive-bys, their what can you physically see from the street. So, and another important thing to note too is, let's say, you have a $300,000 home, you want to build $100,000 accessory dwelling unit in your backyard, your total property is now not going to be worth $400,000. You're not necessarily going to see that one-for-one return. Is kind of what we heard when we talked to some of our fiscal folks. Will you see your investment? Sure, you'll certainly see what your property is worth go up, but you're not going to see a one-for-one return. Is loosely what we when we talk to kind of our fiscal people, what that looks like. Let's see. Oh, new one's at the bottom. So we didn't get an opportunity yet to dive in too deeply about like price per square foot. We do have some examples in the study, which is available just at countyplanning.us/Cleveland Heights ADUs. The study is free to download and you can review it. We do have some just example costs of kind of how the highs and lows of what a typical ADU can cost. But again, if you're building an 800 square foot accessory dwelling unit in Cincinnati or Cleveland Heights versus an 800 square foot, accessory dwelling unit in San Diego, California, the prices are going to look very, very different. In terms of materials, labor, they're going to be very, very different. But I think it's to say, obviously constructing an 800 square foot accessory dwelling unit here in Cleveland Heights isn't going to cost nearly as much as constructing an 800 square foot accessory dwelling unit in San Diego. So here's a good question. So pre-approved designs be put in the zoning code, or will they be part of the design review guidelines? I think we're still, as we update the zoning language, figuring out where pieces and parts belong. There are some things that are maybe more administrative approval now, instead of going through a formalized process, whether that the designs, like the pre-approved designs, if they have that approval from planning commission and they have their support, if someone comes forward and pays for a pre-approved design, could they be administratively approved? I think we're still evaluating our options there, but they could be. So this could really help expedite the process for someone wanting to construct an accessory dwelling unit on their property.
And that's the intent, is to reduce some of that time frame so that you can get these built a little bit more quickly. We know that from the interest we've heard from the public, it tends to be somebody who's trying to take care of their parents, or perhaps it's an adult child who has some type of special needs. And so it tends to be something that they want to be able to implement sooner rather than later. But I think also while we were talking about costs, we recognize that but construction costs are expensive. So it's not like every yard that can possibly have an ADU will have an ADU, because we realize there's a cost involved in the construction of it. So, and you have to meet the building code. So, but it gives a nice option for folks who have that need.
Yes, definitely. So while I still have you, Karen and Eric, maybe time for one more question. So are there opportunities for tax abatements for these properties to encourage ADU development?
So we do have a citywide reinvestment act, so which would allow you to, the increased value of your property would be eligible for a tax abatement. It would depend on where you are in the city, what percentage that is. So there's a formula on our city website about it. It depends on where you are in the community as to how much abatement you would be eligible for. But again, it's only for that increase in valuation that would be abated, a portion of it.
Yeah, I think having the community-wide CRA is definitely beneficial there. Okay, I think that's really all. Unfortunately, all we have time for questions. My email address is there. It's just rnovak@Cuyahoga County. Oh, it's actually .gov now. But I think our .us still works for the time being. But you can email me if you have any other questions that unfortunately we didn't get a chance to get to today. or if you have questions that maybe need a little more clarification on the presentation. And this presentation will be made available. We'll send it out to everyone once we get everything cleaned up in terms of the presentation. And don't forget the CM credit number there at the top. We appreciate you all attending, and we look forward to seeing you all at a future webinar. All right, thank you, everyone.